everyone coming in today. And thanks to the organizers for having my paper in this fantastic lineup of speakers that you have for the semester, I should say. It's quite impressive. So first, before I start, the usual disclaimer applies. So here the views are going to be my own and not the IMF, of course. So today I want to present my paper, The Global Financial Cycle Meets Global Imbalances. And really what I want to study here in the paper is how fluctuations in the leverage of global banks, so how fluctuations in the frictions that global financial intermediaries face are going to impact both gross capital flows and net capital flows. And so the motivation for the paper is that we know from a seminal paper by Gabi and Maggiore, Bruno and Sheen, that large internationally active banks are at the center of the global financial system. And so there has been a large literature which has developed trying to understand how changes in the frictions to these global financial intermediaries can affect different countries or can affect the global economy. In parallel, we have also this literature on the global financial cycle, a term which has been coined by Ellen Ray in 2013, which says that there is a global co-movement in asset prices, in gross capital flows, both inflows going to countries and outflows leaving countries, as well as global banks' leverage. So what this says is that whenever asset prices are high globally, what we tend to see is that there is more global financial activity in the sense of higher gross capital inflows and outflows going into and moving out of countries. And we tend also to see at the same time high global bank leverage. And here throughout the presentation, leverage will be defined as total assets over equity. But so here, kind of a link a bit what is missing. So this literature talks a lot about gross capital flows, but it would be interesting to know, if any, what are the implications for net capital flows. And the reason to focus on net capital flows is that from a financial account perspective, that's the counterpart of the current account balance. And so to start with, there is no reason as to why the global financial cycle would have impact on net capital flows. So net capital flows, by definition, they have to sum up to zero across countries at any point in time, assuming you have no measurement error, right? So that means if there is any impact on net capital flows, some countries on one hand will receive these net capital flows, while some countries will have net capital outflows. And so this is what I want to study here throughout the presentation. Why it would be interesting not just to have a look at gross capital flows, but also net capital flows? Two reasons, basically. The first one at the country level is that anything that will change net capital flows will reflect real effects to the economy, be it on consumption, be it on investment. And so as such, the current account here is a nice variable that is going to link both financial and real outcomes. And so here, I just put again to clarify the illustration, the equation of the current account balance, which can be written as either the difference between gross capital outflows and inflows, which would be net flows, or also as the difference between, broadly speaking, savings and investment at the country level. But then also this distribution of net capital flows across countries can have an impact because they generate what we call global imbalances. And so that may imply systemic risks to the world economy. So the fact that some countries are heavily indebted towards some other countries, for example, may generate instability, a large rebalancing, and so may create some disorder and imply systemic risks to the world economy. So to clarify about what I mean regarding global imbalances, let me try to first give an illustration here. So what you see on this chart is a time series running from the 2000s up to 2020, where I plot the leverage of global financial intermediaries. So that's going to be the blue line. As I said, where leverage is defined as total assets over equity. And here, for the sake of this chart, I'm taking the US broker-dealer leverage ratio, which is also a commonly used measure in the literature to have a look at global leverage. And the red line here is what I define as global imbalances. And so the way it is constructed is by taking, for each and every country at every point in time, the absolute value of their current account balance, then sum these current account balances across countries and normalize that by world GDP. And so what you see here, and the reason why I take the absolute value, as I said before, is that if I was just taking the value by itself, in theory, it would sum up to 0, right? So you want to get here the absolute values of current account balances before you sum them up. So what you see here is that you had this slow increase in global leverage and in global imbalances in the run-up, so to speak, of the global financial cycle from the early 2000s up to 2007, 2008. You had this steep retrenchment in both leverage and imbalances. And then after that, you had a slow movement where, leverage was slowing, retreating, and global imbalances were also slowing, coming down. And so what I will do in this presentation is to try to convince you that the causality runs from global banks' leverage into global imbalances. And I will try to provide evidence both at the, so to speak, high frequency level, which is going to be the quarterly frequency in my case, given the data limitation, and then also like the low frequency over the two phases of the global financial cycle, the up and down. Oh, sorry. Okay, here we go. So in this paper, what I will do, so I will tackle two research questions. The first one is, do fluctuations in the leverage of global banks or global financial intermediaries affect the current account balances of different countries? And if so, which characteristics, which country-specific characteristics can explain these different sensitivities across countries? To answer that question, these questions, I do two things. On the theory side, I will provide a tractable multi-country model where local banks are going to interact with global banks. And so you can think here of the model as an extension of Bruno and Shin, where they had capital flows moving from global banks to local banks, but only one way, where I would add a layer and we will have two-way capital flows, moving from both global banks to local banks, as well as from local banks back to global banks. So this tractable model is going to be fairly simple. That's a two-period model, but it will give me testable prediction that I will test later on in the empirical section of the paper using panel regressions. And I will introduce, I will use the granular IV methodology developed by Gabe and Koijen to estimate a causal effect of global banks' leverage on global imbalances. The three main results here in the paper are going to be that first, leverage has an impact on current account balances. So that's the case when the constraint that these global financial intermediaries are facing change, the distribution of net capital flows across countries is also going to change. How is that going to change? And so what I find is that the impact here will depend on the net external position the local banking system of a country has vis-a-vis global banks. And so here, what does that mean? Let's illustrate with an example. Whenever the leverage of global banks is going to increase, that means the constraints they're facing are going to loosen up, then they will be able to rebalance more capital flows across countries. The countries which are going to attract, which are going to receive net capital inflows, are the countries for which, on average, the domestic banking system has net liabilities vis-a-vis these global banks. The countries which are going to have net capital outflows are the countries for which the domestic banking system, on average, has net assets on these global banks. So what it means is that whenever you have an increase in the leverage of global banks, global imbalances are also going to increase. So existing imbalances will be scaled up. And whenever the leverage of these global banks shrinks, global imbalances are also going to shrink. And now what I will show when you do this decomposition of the current account balance across countries between savings and investment is that the variable that is going to drive this impact across countries is investment and not so much savings. And the very intuitive reason for that is that savings tend to be more sticky in the data than investment. And so that's investment that is going to react more quickly to these changes in the global financial cycle, so to speak. And so here the paper is going to try to provide a bridge between this global financial cycle literature, mostly focusing on gross capital flows, and the literature on global imbalances, which talks about net capital flows. And so I will bring these two together in the paper and explaining them through fluctuations in the leverage of global banks. Of course, massive related literature here. I'm glad to have Scott as a discussant because he contributed, of course. Recently, he had 2 papers in the GME and the GIE about these issues as well. You know, that's a paper also related to the global. Yes, of course.
Can I ask a question? So, in what sense, what kind of shocks is an exogenous leverage shock? And another thing is the risk also a concern here? Basically, the leverage can change with the risk, right?
So these are good questions. So I will answer them in the next slide. But the short answer is that here I will take the leverage as exogenous. So I will study. It will be like comparative statics, where I study if you change the leverage of these global banks, how is that going to impact capital flows? But of course, I mean, the literature has shown that there are many determinants that could explain these changes in the leverage. So that could be higher risk aversion, that could be US monetary policy, it could be this type of shocks. So one thing I'm working on at the moment is, because I'm using this granular instrumental variable, I would like to go in more granular and trying to explain what is driving this change in leverage across banks. But so that's not something I do at the current stage. For now, I will just take the leverage as exogenous, as I will explain. So I do comparative statics, but then, you know, it's an interesting question as to what is driving this leverage and what are these underlying micro shocks here. Okay, let me start with a few stylized facts that are going to guide the way I design the model. Then I'll present you the model and the theoretical implications. And then I'll lastly move to the empirical section. So regarding the stylized facts, the reason I want to build a model where we have global banks interacting with local banks, and the reason why I want to focus on especially the large global banks is related to these different facts here, which are related more to banking. So the first one is that regarding the leverage and fluctuations in the leverage, what you see is that large global banks have both on average a higher and also more volatile leverage than other banks. So let me show you how this looks like with a chart. So here, what I'm doing is that I'm ranking banks by asset size from the largest bank here at 1 to the 100th top global bank here in my sample. And every dot is going to represent a bank quarter observation. So here, this is the leverage for the largest bank for any quarter from the early 2000 up to 2020. And so here what you see is that these buckets of red banks, so like the top 25 banks, they tend to have on average a higher leverage than other banks, but also this leverage ratio is much more volatile. And here, remember, leverage is defined as assets over equity. So I really want to focus here on these top banks for which the leverage fluctuates a lot. What are these banks? You know, these are the usual suspects. So here I put like the top 20. These are the BNP Paribas of this world, the Deutsche Bank, HSBC, JP Morgan. What is interesting in this case is that even among the large global banks, there is a large concentration. So for example, the top global bank here, weighted by asset size, which is BNP Paribas, is like almost 3 times, 4 times larger than BBVA. And so even this heterogeneity in the weights will be helpful when I will use the GIV methodology that I will explain in the empirical section. The second point I want to make.
Question?
Yes, of course.
So for that leverage, the fluctuation, do you think that's, or from the data, is that because of the assets fluctuation? Maybe large bank have some like different like investment portfolio, rather than, I mean, the traditional thing, leverage will change for how you financing your assets.
So that's a very good point. I think it relates to their own business model. So there is a paper, for example, by Adrian and Shin, where they show that the large top global banks, they tend to operate under a value at risk constraint. So that means whenever their assets are going up, whenever their net worth is going up, they can take more risk, and so they can leverage even more, right? While for the other banks, they try to target a given leverage ratio, which means that, you know, whatever happens in their case, leverage is going to be less procyclical. So I think that the reason here, the distinction between these very large banks and the other one is more kind of a business model perspective. It's the way they deal with risk, and the big ones, as I say, they operate under a value at risk constraint. The other one, they tend to target a given leverage ratio.
Thank you.
So the style aspect number 2 is that these global banks, whenever they interact cross-border, so whenever they make business abroad, either by lending or borrowing, usually the main counterpart is going to be another bank. And so this is what I show very quickly here, but using BIS data, when you have a look at these global banks, the positions that they report vis-a-vis different countries is that their claims and liabilities are mostly against other banks here. And so that holds both for whether you split by sector, and for the instrument is going to be loans and deposits. So here in the model, I will just focus on that, on the interaction between global banks and local banks through loans and deposits, because this is what we see mostly in the data. The fact that surprised me a little bit is regarding the external positions here of different countries vis-a-vis global banks, is that first I thought, you know, advanced economies would be lending to these global banks, and these global banks would be in turn lending to emerging market countries. Well, it's more difficult than that. So here I try to split in 2 subgroups the countries which on average are indebted vis-a-vis these global banks. So the countries which are borrowing on net from these global banks. And so these are the countries you see at the top, like Portugal, Spain, advanced economies, but also emerging market countries like Turkey, Poland. And on the other hand, the countries which tend on average to be net creditor on these global banks, where here again you find some advanced economies, some EMEs. And for the sake of the presentation, and to illustrate some of the quantitative result, I will focus on the difference between Portugal and Israel. And so that will help me to clarify here some of the quantitative results that I get. And lastly, and this is a fact which has been you know, highly discussed in the empirical literature, but gross capital inflows and outflows tend to be highly correlated. So that's the case that whenever you tend to have higher capital inflows coming into your country, you have at the same time higher gross capital outflows leaving the country. And that's especially true for banking flows. And so here the model will be able to speak to that pattern of the data as well. All right, so having exposed the style aspect.
Julien, I actually have one question on that last slide.
Yes.
On stylized fact number 2, where you were talking about the counterparties, there in that table you show, you were just specifically looking at cross-border flows and
yes.
cross-border claims and not flows. Sorry, claims and liabilities.
Yes.
But I guess could you, with this BIS data on claims and liabilities, you could also look at it's non-cross border, it's local, and I'm wondering how much are these cross border positions relative to their local positions? Because I can see when they're interacting cross border, they're interacting mainly with other banks, but
Yes.
But interacting with the local customers, they're probably I would imagine they're interacting a lot more with the non-bank sector. And I was just wondering what's the breakdown? How much are these cross borders as a position of their total portfolio?
I see. I mean, that's a good point. So I didn't look into that decomposition, so I will not provide you with a quantitative answer here, but that's something I can explore indeed. So here I was mostly focused on the external side of it, but I could also, yeah, like I could look into the data and tell you what share does that represent versus their total position, and what's the split when you have a look at the domestic positions that they have. That's a good point. Honestly, I don't know the decomposition for the domestic side.
Okay.
But I'll keep it in mind. All right, let me turn on to the model now. I will just give you a brief overview of the model, and then depending on how we are doing on time, I'll see if I go deeper or not. So the model here is going to be a fairly simple two-period model with n countries which are going to be indexed by I, and that's a single good economy for the sake of simplicity. Each country has a representative household, which is going to receive an endowment in period 1 and save via local bank safe deposits. So the household is just going to do simple consumption saving decision. In each country, there is going to be a unit continuum of local banks. And so these local banks are going to be ex ante identical. They are going to raise deposits from their own domestic households, and they have access to a risky bank-specific project with a return that is going to have a country-specific component and idiosyncratic component. The local banks here, I'm going to assign that they face an outside friction, which is that they can only lend to or borrow from global banks only. So there is no risk sharing inside the country, so to speak. And so here I'm taking that friction a la Gertler, Kiyotaki a bit to the extreme to get an easy closed form solution, but the main results would go through, as long as there is no perfect diversification within the country. And so the reason to introduce this friction, or the rationale for that, could be seen in two ways. The first one is that, maybe you're BNP Paribas and you have subsidiaries or affiliates all over the world, and it's easier for you to raise money from these subsidies or to lend to these subsidies versus, having the subsidy in Brazil, borrowing or lending to another Brazilian bank. So that could be one. The other one is that as a local bank, the cost for you to default on the global bank might be much higher than the cost of defaulting on another small local bank. Because, for example, if you default or if you do not repay the loan to the large global bank, maybe you lose access to global dollars, for example. And so the cost here is so high that the global bank can safely lend to you, but the local bank will find it too risky and so will not do it. So here I'm just taking that assumption to the extreme to get closed form solutions. And then lastly, the last player that we're going to have across countries, there is going to be a unit continuum of global banks, but here this continuum will be across countries, not within countries, with a share SI of global banks located in country I. And these global banks here, they do the global financial intermediation, so they reallocate funds after the returns are revealed everywhere. And these banks are subject to an exogenous leverage constraint. And so here, as I mentioned in my answer before, I will just take the leverage constraint as exogenous here, of course, knowing that there is some endogeneity, and so some papers have tackled that question already, and I will be more careful when I come to the empirical section to make sure I deal with that endogeneity. So that's the broad setup. If I were to resume, to summarize the model in one picture, that would be the picture. So here, just for the sake of simplicity, I'm considering a case where n is equal to 3. So we only have 3 countries, A, B, and C, where, again, for the sake of simplicity for that picture, all global banks are located in country A. So SA is equal to 1 and SB, SC are equal to 0. And where the average country-specific return in country B is higher than in country A and itself is higher than in country C. So how does the model work here? So in period 1, what you have is that households are going to put deposits in their own local banks after the returns are before, sorry, the returns are revealed. So these local banks, they take the deposits, then they face this shock regarding the return, and once the shock are realized, they will start reallocating funds like across countries. And so the global banks will do that. So the global banks in each and every country, they will receive funding from the least, so to speak, productive local banks. And in turn, they will provide financing to the most, so to speak, productive local banks. And these local banks in turn will invest in their productive assets. So what happens is that you have both two ways capital flows for each and every country. And then whenever the leverage constraint that this global bank face is relaxed, so whenever the leverage can go up, the size of the arrows here is going to increase. So existing global imbalances will be scaling up. So country C, for example, which has net assets on average vis-a-vis these global banks, will have even more net external assets. So it will have on average net outflows, and country B will receive net inflows, even though both countries will have both gross higher inflows and outflows.
One quick question
You have a
on
question? Yep.
that setup. So I guess these local banks are they're basically just like a veil. They're just it's the bank that's dealing with the leverage constraint. That's the large global bank. And these local banks, they're just taking deposits and making investment. You can I guess at a net position, you could really think of just these local banks as a veil, and you can just think of, in this case, country B would be a country with that's a net borrower, and country C would be a country that's a net lender, and that whatever the local bank is doing is just netting out.
So I agree with your point, and so two points here. So the reason why I introduced these local banks, even though in some sense they're a veil, is because what I show you in the data before from the BIS is that these global banks, they tend mostly to interact with other banks. Mm-hmm. But you could, in the same spirit, think that these global banks, they directly finance the productive investment in every country. So in some sense, you can remove these local banks, but that would mean households will have to put their deposits directly into the global banks, and the global banks would invest directly in productive assets. That's one way to think about it. I agree. The reason why I put them in the middle is because what you see in the data actually is that these global banks tend actually, so it would be highly counterfactual to say that, because these global banks, they interact with local banks. And also it will be interesting for me because when I go to the empirical section from the BIS, I have like good data on this position of local banks vis-a-vis global banks. And so this has a clear one-to-one mapping into my empirical section later on. So that's why I choose that kind of specification. But you could think also about like a large company. So the global bank in a different model could be a large company with different subsidiaries across countries, and that large company would move flows across country. That would be another alternative explanation. I agree with you.
Okay.
Okay, let me go very quickly. So I went through the intuition already. So like that's the model. I will go fairly quickly here. So the households, of course, they want to maximize their utility. They can consume today, tomorrow. Their budget constraints are given by this, so their endowment, whatever they want to save. And so in period 2, they get their deposits with the interest rates from their local bank. The local banks here, they can finance this project, which is going to produce output according to this production function. So here, I'm making the production function linear for simplicity, and I will assume that the return at the country-specific level is bounded, because if I had not these assumptions, then all the banks would like to finance only the unique local bank with the most productive project. And so just to avoid that, I make sure that this is bounded, you know, and so that there is so much they can finance. Here, GX is going to be the global CDF of project returns at the end of period 1, and FI of X is the CDF of project returns at the end of period 1 in country I. And so you have two distributions regarding like the productivity or the project returns if you want. One is global and the other ones are local. The local banks, so as Scott mentioned, you know, they're a bit of a veil. So what they do is that they want to maximize their expected profits. They are going to collect deposits, and then they will either, if they are high productive local banks, invest in their own project. If they are low productive local banks, they will prefer to lend their funds to the global banks and earn a higher return there. And if they are somehow in between, so if their project is in between, they will be inactive on global markets. So they will just use their funds and finance their local project without borrowing to finance it even more or without lending overseas. And so here, as I said, the technological constraint makes sure that you know, it's not only one local bank that is funded in all the world. So that's just one trick here to avoid that corner solution. And then the global banks, they will reallocate their lending and borrowing. So they have that monopoly power, right? Where they have the ability to reallocate funds across countries. So they're subject to a balance sheet identity and to a leverage constraint here. And so here the leverage constraint is going to be taken as exogenous. And so that is going to set a limit on the amount that they can lend on global markets. So as I said, you're going to have three types of local banks. The high return, for which the return on the asset is higher than the interest rate they would have to pay on the interbank market. And so these local banks, they will leverage up and try to finance the asset up to KO per bar. You have the intermediate average return local banks, which are just going to use their own equity and the deposits that they got to finance the asset. And you have the low returns bank, for which the return is lower than the return they would get by lending on the interbank market. And so these banks, basically, they just lend their funds to the global banks. And then here you have the global banks, for which you know, for which the balance sheet has to balance by definition. And so this will give us the equilibrium on the wholesale market, where global banks lending has to be equal to local banks borrowing. And so that's given by the formula in equation 1. If you go one step further and you, for simplicity, just consider a symmetric equilibrium where all countries ex ante look the same, then this equilibrium condition simplifies to condition number 2. What you can do with that is that you can figure out that the interbank borrowing and lending rates will be a function of the leverage constraint, will be a function of like the tightness of the leverage constraint that these global banks face. So lambda star is the point at which, you know, the leverage constraint is not binding anymore, and so the interbank borrowing and lending rate are equalized. But as long as lambda is lower than this lambda star, then you will have some friction in the market. And so this is going to introduce a wedge between the lending and the borrowing rate on the interbank markets. So of course, so here I took a very special case where RI is equalized across countries. So the country-specific return is the same across countries, but like the shape would be the same. Basically, as lambda goes up, so as the constraint on these global banks is relaxed, the lending rate is going to increase and the borrowing rate on the interbank market is going to drop. And lastly, to close the model, you need the equilibrium for the retail market deposit. And so here, the local banks, basically, they will offer an interest rate such as they equalize the marginal expected value of the deposits to what they will have to pay to their depositors. So, I mean, this is just a way to close the model, but let me skip here this point for the sake of time. Okay, what are the implications for both gross and net capital flows once we have set that model? So the first message here is that gross flows are going to increase in leverage, both at the country level and also at the global economy perspective, consistent with the global financial cycle hypothesis. So for the gross outflows from country I, for now, you can just forget about SI. Let's assume that this country has no global banks at home. So this term is equal to 0, and this would be equal to 1. The size of the global, the gross outflows from this country will be an increasing function of lambda, so the constraint that these global banks are facing, but is also a function of this ratio of the local CDF for projects versus the global CDF of projects. And so what it means is that if your country, if you tend to have more low return projects at home versus the average number of low return projects globally, you will have higher gross outflows. And the same logic will apply for the gross inflows here at the bottom. If on average in your country, you tend to have the number of high productive projects that you have at home is higher than the number of high productive projects on average globally, then you will tend to attract more gross capital inflows. And of course, both of them are increasing in lambda, which means that whenever lambda goes up, you have this positive correlation between gross capital outflows and gross capital inflows. So that's one. The second thing is that once you start to have an SI that is different from 0, so that means when your country is hosting global banks, also the size of these gross outflows and gross inflows will be higher than for countries which do not have these global banks. And that's something we also see in the data. Like, so for example, for a country like France will have higher gross inflows and outflows as a share of GDP compared to a country like Peru, for example, which does not have global banks at home. And so here the model can speak to that. Now, the interesting thing, and that's proposition 1 here in the paper, is that when you take the difference between these gross outflows and inflows that I showed you in the previous slide, you can compute net flows. And here what you find is that net flows will also be a function of the lambda here and will be increasing in lambda, but the direction will depend on this psi I. And here the psi I really in the model measures the country net external assets on global banks. So as I said before, it means that countries which have net assets on global banks, they will have even more net assets on these global banks. So they will have net outflows after an increase in the leverage of global banks. For countries which have net liabilities to these banks, whenever the leverage goes up, they will tend to have even more liabilities. And so here, in some sense, you can think about this interaction term as something that you will find in Gabe and Maggiore, for example, where whenever you relax the constraint on the global financial intermediary, everything here is going to be scaled up. So one thing I want to say here is, usually when I get to that point, I get a criticism regarding the Lucas puzzle. And so people say, because this thing really is a measure of the average productivity of the country versus other countries in the world, right? And so people would tell me, look, but we know from the Lucas puzzle that capital is not flowing in the right direction, it's flowing from emerging market countries to advanced economies, and that's not the way it works. That's true, but that's especially true for public flows. So if you have a look at private flows only, then what you do find is that private flows, they flow in the right direction. And so here I'm providing some evidence, but there are papers on that from Alfaro and co-authors, where here in the cross section, what I do, I have a look at the average net private capital inflows going to any country, and I regress that on the average GDP per capita growth of the country over that period. And so here I'm looking at the period from 2000 to 2020. And what I do find is that countries which have higher GDP per capita growth, so the countries with more productivity, they tend to receive more average net private capital inflows, which would be consistent with the story that I have here in the model. And so here the result hold independently of whether you look at different variables, the IFS from the IMF or the Lane-Mills severity, and depending on, it does not depend on the sample that you take here. So that's one point I wanted to make. Okay, so what I want to do next with the about 10 minutes that I have, maybe I can use a bit more, is to test this relationship in the empirical section.
Maybe there like a Julien, you have a question?
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Julien.
Hi,
Good to
Howland.
So I'm just trying to wrap my head around this kind of the equivalence between the net capital outflows in your model versus the current account, right? So in your model, there's no trade. The countries there's no imbalance because one country consumes too much relative to the other guys, right? So how should I actually think about the current account thing? And then you move on to talk about like private outflows versus like public outflows. But if you think about current account as a whole, it doesn't really matter if you're talking about private versus public, right? So I'm just trying to understand the equivalence of the terminology here.
Okay. I mean, these are great questions. Thanks, Howland. So let me answer them in reverse order. So the first one is what I will show you in the empirical section is that the effect is here for total flows. So if I include also public flows, when I have a look at the current account, so to speak, I find an effect. I find that the effect is even stronger when I have a look just at net private flows. So I will do this decomposition later on, but that means that the effect that I find on net private flows is not fully counteracted by any effect that would happen on public flows. So that's one. So you have this effect on private, and the effect is so large compared to what is happening on public flows that you also see it in the current account balance. Related to your first question, it's true. So here, I mean, there are two ways you can see the current account balance. Is either you see it from a trade perspective or a finance perspective. So here I'm fully taking a finance perspective where it's a trade in assets. There is no trade in goods in this case. That would be interesting, you know, to have a look at this and have a look at it from a trade side. I know Damien Capel here at the IMF is working more on the trade side, so he may have things to say about this. But yeah, that's I prefer to focus on the asset side here. And in theory, you know, the two of them should impact the current account. So it would be good to see whether the effect on trade would be there as well.
Okay. Thank you, Julien.
Thanks for your question. Okay, let me move on to the empirical evidence if there is no more question. So what I want to do here is to use in the baseline, I will have panel regressions where I'm going to do these panel regressions for about more than 40 countries. So I'm covering both advanced and emerging market countries over the past 20 years or so at a quarterly frequency. What I want to regress here, this YIT will be one of these variables. So I will focus on the current account as a share of GDP, but I will also show you results for net private outflows. So taking out the reserves here. And I will regress them on these variables. The most important one here, because it directly maps into the formula I showed you before, is the interaction between the leverage of global banks LT and the position of the domestic banking system vis-a-vis global banks, this PI. Here, because there might be, so in the model, I took the leverage as exogenous, but of course, there might be some endogeneity issue. And so there might be like, you know, variables that could explain this link between leverage and current account balances. So I try to control for this by including the world and country real GDP growth. I also control for the VIX, like the risk aversion, because this is known to be a driver of this also potentially leverage of global banks. So I control for these. I control for country real GDP growth because that's the variable that we see mostly in the current account balance determinant. So whenever a country is growing more, then they tend to have a current account deficit. As Howland would say, maybe financed by trade, you know, it's like you do more consumption. And so that's more kind of a trade impact. So that's the regression that I want to estimate. All of them are going to be estimated in the first step via OLS. I will include country fixed effect. I also have country specific linear time trends in case you're concerned that the current account as a share of GDP is non-stationary in some countries. And I will double cluster standard errors by both country and time. So the prediction for the model is that this
Oh,
coefficient should be, yes.
Can I ask a big picture question? So it's kind of like you have established the stylized facts first, and then you have models to try to explain the facts. But now my big picture question is what is the empirical evidence M for?
So I mean,
So
first
what,
to show
what
you
kind
that
of
it's,
conclusion you try to achieve? Yeah.
so the first point is that first I want to show you that the effect is here, and so I have a significant effect here by the regression. The second point is that I'm able to quantify the effect through the regression, so I can give you some sense of the quantitative impact, so that I will tell you as well. And lastly, I want to see whether this effect that I'm capturing here can explain this fluctuation in global imbalances. And so here also I will be able to show you that through the regressions.
Okay.
So yeah, if you bear with me for the next couple of slides, I hope that will make sense, but I'm happy to discuss later. So here, what the prediction of the model is going to be that this beta 2 coefficient should be positive for the current account and for net outflows. I didn't talk about it, but what we'll see is that the effect is mostly through investment, and that we won't see anything for savings. So as I said, I'm using panel data for 41 countries. The global variables and the country-specific variable are quite standard, I would say. So let me skip this for now. So that's the result that I get here on the empirical side. So when I do the regression for the current account, I just left here the coefficient on the interaction term, the beta 2. I found that this coefficient is positive and significant. And to answer the question Haunan had before, it's even more significant and more positive when I just focus on private net outflows. And so here, the quantitative interpretation of that is that whenever you have a 1 standard deviation increase in the leverage of global banks, a country like Portugal, which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, will have a drop in its current account balance by about 1% of GDP. So this effect, is significant, and is also quantitatively quite important, quite sizable. For a country like Israel, on the opposite, which was on the other side, if you remember, it was at the bottom of my list. Whenever the leverage of global banks goes up by 1 standard deviation, this country will have an increase in its current account balance by about 0.5, 0.6% of GDP in the same quarter. So here, these results are robust. I've conducted multiple checks, and I'm happy to do more if you can think about one, but I'm taking different measures for the leverage. I take these variables in first difference. I study the pre and post 2008 period. I exclude the big 5, so the countries with global banks at home, and we have essentially the same results. What I want to do next is, in the maybe few minutes left, is to talk about this granular instrumental variable here that I use to provide the evidence of a causal effect running from the leverage of global banks to global imbalances. So in the previous specification, I was controlling for global factors. I was controlling for the VIX. I was controlling for the real business cycle. But here I want to exploit the heterogeneity in size across these global banks that I talked about early in my presentation. And what I want to do is to use this methodology. And so the first step would be to do a factor analysis. So when you have a look, so I have a panel of data for the leverage of global banks. And so what I want to do here is to take out the commonality. I want to take out the first 2 factors that are driving this commonality in the change in the leverage across global banks. The reason why I take 2 factors here is also driven by a paper that Scott wrote with 2 co-authors, where they show that basically there are 2 factors behind global capital flows. So I want to make sure I remove these. And so the epsilons that I get are going to be the idiosyncratic shocks at the bank level on the leverage at any given quarter T. And so then the GIV will be constructed as the difference between the share weighted average of these epsilon minus the equally weighted average of this epsilon. Because I'm doing a principal component analysis in the first step, by construction, these equally weighted average will be equal to 0. So here in my case, the GIV will be the weighted average of these idiosyncratic shocks which are affecting these local banks. So that's also one question we had at the beginning of the presentation. What I'm working on now is to try to provide some narrative analysis and to try to see what are these idiosyncratic shocks. So why is it the case, for example, that JP Morgan in 2010 Q1 had a massive negative shock on its leverage ratio? And so here I'm trying to provide some narrative evidence, at least for the top shocks. And what you find is that it's mostly driven by first regulation. So it's Basel III, hitting some banks like harder depending on their initial leverage positions than other. It could be linked to a change in the risk aversion of the CEO or the CFO of the company. So this is slightly more tricky to see, but I mean, these are the kind of things I'm after here to try to provide a narrative for these shocks. But so once you have these shocks, so these shocks by construction, they are not related to any residual that you may have in the equation, and they're relevant because, I mean, to the extent that they impact global imbalances, they should only impact global imbalances through the leverage of global banks. And so I find that they are highly correlated with leverage and correlated with the VIX and the real GDP growth. So once you do this regression and you use this instrument, this GIV instrument, what you do find is that these coefficients here again are positive and highly significant for both the current account and net outflows. They're slightly lower than before, so that that could be due to the fact that maybe the previous measure was a bit more endogenous. And again, I have conducted multiple robustness checks, and so this result tend to hold across different specifications. The very last point I want to make, so here I was mostly talking about evidence at the quarterly frequency, at the high frequency. I want to test also whether this holds at a longer horizon. So if you take a perspective pre-global financial crisis and post-global financial crisis, what the model says is that the countries which were more net debtor vis-a-vis global banks by the time of the global financial crisis should have had the biggest reversal in their current account when the leverage of global banks was dropping. And so here, this is what I show you in this chart. So what you have is the change in the net external position of the country in 2014-15 versus its position in 2007-2008 against its net external position vis-a-vis global banks in 2007-2008. So what you see is that countries like Portugal, which were heavily indebted vis-a-vis these global banks, for which the domestic banking system was heavily indebted vis-a-vis global banks, had the biggest reversal in the cumulative current account balance over that period post-global financial crisis. And the opposite happened for a country like Israel, which had, on average, which was a net lender to these global banks around the global financial crisis. So that's also evidence, that this mechanism hold not only at the quarterly frequency, but also over a few years. And lastly, when you take the regression I was showing you before and you try to see what would be, so the regression was able to give you a number for the current, like the predicted value for the current account balance of a country I at time t. Then what if you do what I was showing in the first slide of this presentation? You just take the absolute value of these predicted current account balances, you sum them up and you normalize by world GDP. What you find is that the mechanism here in the model is about to rationalize somehow the increase in global imbalances before 2007, 2008, this huge drop here, and then the slow decrease in global imbalances up to 2020. Okay, I'm slightly over time, so let me conclude. So here in this paper, I propose a multi-country model with both local and global banks. In the model and in the data, changes in global banks leverage not only have impact on gross flows, but also net flows. And so in that way, I reconcile this global financial cycle literature with global imbalances. And the variable that matters in my case is the net external position of a country on global banks. And that explains the differentiated impact of changes in global banks leverage across countries. One thing I didn't mention is that so far the paper and the presentation is about quantities. And so it's about capital flows. But I have some extensions where I have a look also at prices, so at equity prices and the real exchange rate. And so here let me just show you what happened to the real return, to the real equity returns. What I find is that a positive change in leverage, so an increase in the leverage of global banks, is associated with a higher increase in asset prices in countries which have higher net liabilities vis-a-vis these global banks. So the mechanism not only is here for quantity, so for capital flows, but also if you have a look at some prices variable like equities or exchange rate, you do see this differentiated response across country. Let me stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for Julien's presentation. So Scott will discuss the paper, but before his discussion, I want to announce for our next few seminars before when people are still here. So our next seminar will be on November 15th, which is 2 weeks away from now, by Professor Yan Bei and Dr. Xiang Fang from Hong Kong University, and Vivian Yue from Emory will be the discussion of that seminar. And then after that, we will have Wenxin from Harvard University to present her paper on November 29th. For both of these seminars, so it will be the same time for the US, but it will be 1 hour late for China because it's going to be in the winter time. But when we go to December, when we go to the seminars by Annie Lee from Johns Hopkins and Charles Engel from Wisconsin, we will adjust the time. So for the US time, for the December seminars, the US time will be 1 hour early, and then the time for China will be the same as for now. Okay, so I finished my advertisement time. So then I will give the time to Scott for the discussion.
Well, thank you, Ren. Let's see, let me, all right. Yes, so I'm Scott Davis from the Dallas Fed, and of course the usual disclaimer applies to this presentation. So this paper presents a model to explain the movement of both gross and net capital flows of the global financial cycle, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about as well. The key here really is borrower heterogeneity, and by borrower I mean so borrowers have some borrowers have more uses of funds than sources of funds, and thus they're net borrowers, and some have more sources of funds than uses of funds, and they're net lenders. And all this intermediation between borrowers and lenders has to go through global banks who are subject to a leverage constraint. So a positive shock to this leverage constraint results in borrowers borrowing more and lenders lending more. And so on the national level, this means that countries with a negative net foreign asset position, who are net borrowers, after a positive shock to the leverage constraint, they borrow more. They have a decrease in their current account, or a larger current account deficit. And then countries that are net lenders have the opposite. So that it explains that fluctuation in global imbalances that Julien talked about. And then the paper also assumes this heterogeneity between savers and borrowers applies within a country. So all savers and borrowers within a country, they still use this global intermediary. And so that means at the same time we have gross foreign assets and gross foreign liabilities. And so a positive leverage shock means that savers will lend more and the borrowers will borrow more, meaning that you get this co-movement in global and gross inflows and outflows. So this is a very nice paper. As Julien mentioned, I actually have a pair of papers with Eric Van Winkoop looking at the same issue. One that came out this summer in the JIE that was about modeling gross capital flows, and one that's forthcoming in the JME that's modeling net capital flows. So we're looking at a lot of this same empirical evidence that Julien just presented. Now, our focus in these papers is on advanced economies, which is really a portfolio choice model, and we're focusing on wealth effects. And I really see that this paper, in fact, I'll come back to this at the end of my discussion today, this paper really complements our papers because this focuses on frictions and intermediation. And it's probably much more relevant for thinking about emerging markets, as well as for thinking about movements and flows around crises. And I'll get back to this point. So for my first comment, and I kind of alluded to this comment earlier when I asked Julien that question about the cross-border banking data that he was presenting. So this discussion of gross flows really hinges on this assumption that all intermediation goes through these global banks, even within country intermediation. So you could have a net saver in a country, you could have a net borrower in a country, but they still have to go through these global banks. So I know from my work with Eric and that paper that I just mentioned that modeling gross flows is hard. You need a reason for a country would have both a gross asset and a gross liability position in the same asset, which means that at the same time you take a positive position and a negative position. In fact, in our paper, Eric and I, we model this by assuming that these assets are country-specific risky assets. So basically like a lupus tree in every country. And so you have a diversification benefit for holding a bunch of foreign assets. But now this paper has this assumption that all of the borrowing and lending has to go through these global banks. That's how they're able to get around this fact that how to make both gross foreign assets positive and gross foreign liabilities positive. Now, I know that there is some cross-border saving and lending. So a U.S. resident can save with a foreign bank and another U.S. resident can borrow from a foreign bank. So, I mean, we do see this in the data. But quantitatively, this was a part of the reason for that question that I asked about cross-border flows versus cross-border positions versus local positions of banks is how important is this? Can the fact that some U.S. residents are saving with foreign banks while other U.S. residents are borrowing from foreign banks, can quantitatively that really explain the fluctuations in gross flows that we see in the data? And can it explain this co-movement in growth? It can qualitatively explain it, but just how big of an impact does it have quantitatively? And then for my second and last comment, and actually Rin sort of alluded to this in his question towards the end of the presentation. So the paper has an empirical section where the author shows that the main predictions of the model, basically that the current account falls in a net borrower when leverage increases, shows that the model qualitatively matches what we see in the data. But what about quantitative? How much does this channel that's explained by the in the paper, how much does that actually show us quantitatively what we're seeing? So I know this, can the author devise a way to link the empirical results with the numerical predictions in the model? Now, I know that the model is a two-period model. We're not talking about a estimation of a model here, but can this at least give us some idea about whether the model can deliver ballpark numerical results? And so finally, I'll sort of finish up this comment by presenting this, which is a table out of my paper with Eric that's forthcoming in the JME, which I actually presented in this seminar series way back in March of 2023. But I won't go into all the details here. But basically, we thought in this model about a way to set up a way to look at the model and deliver quantitative predictions that could be compared to what we see in our empirical results. And basically, we find that our mechanism, which is based on wealth effects, it explains about 50 to 60% of the fluctuations in total net flows, basically in the current account. Now, more during normal times than during crises. In fact, it explains most of it during normal times, but much less during crisis times. Now, we don't consider emerging markets in that paper. Now, but I suspect that our mechanism, our wealth effect mechanism in my papers with Eric, would be much weaker in emerging markets. And so when I said I think this paper is really kind of a complement to what we do, I'd be interested in sort of seeing, does this paper, does it fill in some of the gaps that we weren't able to explain through our wealth effect mechanism? Do you get stronger empirical results, emerging market results than we would get with our wealth effect? Would you have stronger results during a crisis than we would get with our wealth effect mechanism? So I'd really encourage the author to think about how to do more to actually make some quantitative connections between that empirical section and the predictions of the model. But other than that, I really enjoyed this paper. I've been seeing it over time because I've been working on some similar topics at the time, and I've cited this paper, and Julien cites my papers. So I'm interested to see where this paper continues. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks to Scott's discussion, and also many thanks for Scott's support to our seminar, especially the paper presented at the early stage of our seminar series. Now, Julien, do you want to take some time to respond to Scott's questions?
Yeah, sure. So first, thanks a lot, Scott, for the nice discussion, and also thanks everyone for the questions along the presentation. So these are great comments. So I'll think more carefully about these. So just on the first comment that you made, I think what I understood during the presentation is a bit different from what I got just now. But I think what is important is to what extent banks intermediate. So what's the share of banks in cross-border capital flows? So for that, I mean, there is evidence, that there is a paper by Avijef, by Shebnem and co-authors, where they show that the fluctuations in gross capital flows is mostly driven by banks and not so much, let's say, or less, so to speak, by FDI and portfolio. So I think the metric here is what's the share of banks in total cross-border? And so that I think I have a pretty good sense, but also we could, I'll have a look at what's the share of domestic versus cross-border as well. So that's something I'll look into as well. The second one, yeah, I agree. So that's a bit what I try to do at the end with the last exercise, when I have these global imbalances, the actual one and the ones predicted by the model. And I want to see that, it's, I mean, fairly, you cannot match 1-to-1, but you can explain some of it. And actually the fit is, I think, not bad at all, but maybe I can try to give a more quantitative statement. I agree with that, and see how the model would perform for EMEs, and especially during crisis time, as you said. So yeah, I think the model, the mechanism you have, may be working for advanced economies during normal times, and maybe mine can fit indeed for more crisis times and for EMEs as well. So that's point well taken.
Mhm.
Thanks a lot.